So I'm sitting in the spot where we're gonna be planting today, and I grabbed a little bit of the clay here and wetted it down. If you wet down your clay soil and kind of rub it between your fingers like this, it should feel smooth to the touch, not coarse or grainy. And that's because the particles that make up clay soil are actually up to 1,000 times smaller than the particles that make up sandy soil. And all those teeny tiny particles in here, well, they have very small spaces between themselves, or very small pores. And those small pores result in a very tight, dense structure with a high capacity to hold on to water. We're gonna circle back to the properties of clay soil particles here in a minute. But for now, we need to do something to combat this close texture and high water retention capacity because it can stop root growth in its tracks. What we need is to introduce a whole lot of organic material to the mineral heavy clay soil here to produce a loamier, softer mix. My favorite way to do that is to dig a very deep planting hole, placing half of the soil into a wheelbarrow or large bucket and the other half into another container to discard elsewhere. The planting hole should be at least 1 foot deep and wide, and even bigger for large plants like, say, melons. All right, next up, we gotta get a lot of organic materials into the native clay soil that we put into our bucket or our wheelbarrow earlier. I like to do equal parts or maybe air a little bit on the side of the organic material. I'm using steer manure today, and that is typically what I use because ultimately my goal is just to get a high volume of organics into this soil, and steer manure is quite a bit cheaper than alternatives like straight compost or chicken manure. Compost and chicken manure are higher in plant nutrients and frankly, they're just better amendments. But today my goal is volume or quantity over quality, so I'm going with this. You can make your own choice on that front. All right, let's go ahead and get this in, and then we're gonna break up any large clumps here so that it mixes together nicely. At this point, I'm taking a look at the soil here and deciding, probably not quite as loose as I was hoping. So I'm gonna add a little bit more steer manure into the mix. I'm liking the texture. It's definitely not potting soil, but it's more than loose enough to plant in. Most of everyone's favorite garden plants, like this beautiful tomato right here, prefer a slightly acidic environment to grow in. Most clay soils, however, are moderately alkaline. To combat that mismatch, we're going to add an acidic amendment into our mix, like this sphagnum peat moss. This stuff has gotten a little bit pricey though, so I don't use a ton of it. One tip with the sphagnum peat moss is it is super hydrophobic and difficult to water when it is fresh out of the bag. It gets just super dry during transport and stored, so it's easier if you break it up before mixing it in and then water it down thoroughly. Hey, by the way, if you don't want to use sphagnum peat moss due to environmental concerns, totally fine. You can try using elemental sulfur instead to acidify the soil a little bit, or you can skip the acidification step altogether. The manure is going to help bring our soil closer to neutral anyways. Quick heads up, some plants, like this lavender right here, do actually prefer a slightly alkaline medium to grow in. If you pull up Google right now and search for clay soil benefits, you're gonna find a ton of references to how clay soil is super high in nutrients, which has the potential to be very true, but it also has some important caveats. And to get into the why, and we want to get into the why, we need to have a little bit of chemistry talk first, but I promise it's going to be super fast. Okay, so the particles that comprise clay soil are predominantly negatively charged anions, and that means they are pretty good at holding onto or binding to positively charged cations and preventing those cations from washing away. Now, lucky for us, many important plant nutrients in the soil are cations. They are positively charged ions, things like potassium and magnesium and calcium. And what that means is our clay soil is actually pretty good at holding on to important soil nutrients rather than letting them wash away like a sandier soil might. All the time, those cations are being replaced or exchanged with other cations. And as that exchange happens, those ions or those plant nutrients become available in the soil for our plants to take up via their root system. Now you'll notice that I didn't mention a pretty important nutrient in there, nitrogen, and that's because nitrogen is only positively charged in some of its forms. The ammonium form is positively charged and the nitrate form isn't. And absolutely none of that means that your clay soil as it exists today is actually high in any kind of nutrients. In fact, a lot of clay soil is basically the result of removing that top layer of soil, leaving just a sort of dead hard pan with really low nutrient content overall. It really just means that our soil has a high capacity to hold on to nutrients. And of course, all this organic material that we just added in, that's gonna help, but it's pretty mild stuff overall, and it's gonna take some time to break down and become available for our plants to uptake in the first place. And all of that means it's a pretty good idea if we mix in some additional concentrated fertilizers at the time of planting. So we can go ahead and do that right now if you've got some seeds or a seedling ready to go, or you can do it a little bit later if you're just prepping the ground today. For this step, I like to use either about a tablespoon of a balanced 16-16-16 synthetic fertilizer or a heaping 1/3 cup of organic vegetable fertilizer. By the way, if you want to check how much heavy metal content is in your fertilizer of choice, I've got a really quick 1-minute video on how to look that up. All right, it is time to get all that soil back in the ground. We were going for aeration and we got it. All this dirt is a lot larger in volume now, but that is a good thing. Just mount it up in there. Hey, if you think this information might help you garden in clay soil this year, I would so appreciate it if you could give the video a quick like. Really helps us out. Thank you so much. All right, let's get back into it. So all that water retention we talked about earlier can lead to really low levels of oxygen in the soil, which is, you know, not great for plants. And actually everything we are doing today is going to help a little bit on that front. But if you want to take a specific measure to help with aeration, to help with oxygenation, you can introduce worms. Worms are basically just terrific little aeration machines as they go about their day eating organic materials and improving our dirt. This is just a big cup of pure worm castings and lots of red wriggler worms I just took out of our worm compost bin back here. But if you don't have your own worm bin, no worries. All that organic material that we just added into the planting hole is going to attract a ton, and you can also attract even more by adding a thick layer of wood chip mulch onto the top of the soil, which we are going to go do in 1 second here. And this is also a good time to go ahead and put our seedling into the ground. I've got a really nice little ping tongue eggplant I'm excited to plant, so let's go do it. Have you ever noticed how your clay soil literally shrinks and cracks as it dries out, only to swell like a balloon when the rain hits again? It's midsummer here. This is an area where we don't have anything planted and we haven't been watering, and you can see how major the cracking is. Not hard to imagine how a crack that I can literally put my hand into is gonna be bad for root growth. Luckily, this stuff works absolute miracles when it comes to modulating that cycle of expansion and contraction in heavy clay soil. Just good old-fashioned wood chip mulch. I can't overstate how effective this stuff is in keeping that soil from fully drying out. The other benefit to avoiding those really dry periods is the soil isn't going to become so hydrophobic. See, clay soil, when it is fully bone dry, can actually be a little bit difficult to water because the water is just gonna sit on top and kind of dissipate outwards rather than penetrating downwards until it is fully wetted out. And that thick wood chip layer is gonna make it much easier for you to retain moisture in there and keep the water where you want it throughout the season, along with a good irrigation strategy. Now, one way that clay soil can actually be prone to some evaporation is when the water just sits on that top layer, on that hard pan, and doesn't sink down into the soil where we need it. So it's more effective and efficient to actually water very slowly. Personally, I find that a lot easier to do with an automated drip line. So let's install this simple drip emitter over our new planting hole. If you have access to chickens or pigs or some other rooting animal, you can let them live in that garden space and scratch and root and basically use that area for a season or two, and then let the ensuing manure break down over a down season. Really good way to get some organic materials, lots of aeration into that garden soil without a lot of work on your part. Clay soil is also going to benefit from most of your traditional cover crops like bioaccumulators, things like alfalfa or wheat, or your nitrogen fixers, your clover, and your legumes. I also recommend trying to find some cover crops with really deep root systems, things like Japanese radish, daikon. Daikon's going to do a nice job keeping your soil aerated even when you aren't using it for anything else. Plus, daikon is pretty nice to cook with. This is a really nice mix. It's got all that stuff in it. I will link to it in the description. I really like using it. All right, y'all, final tip here. Now that we've gone through this full process, it's probably better that we never do it again, at least in that same spot. Now that we have some more balanced soil, all we need to do in future plantings, future years, is add additional organic materials, add additional mulch, and let that balanced soil build up an ecosystem that's just going to benefit our plants more and more over time. And that is all I got. I really hope this video helps you overcome any challenges you're facing with your clay soil this year and build just a killer garden. And as always, I hope to see you on the next one.